You know what's unsettling about being a human? We like to think we remember things accurately. We like to think that if something happened, someone wrote it down. And if someone wrote it down, it must be true. But here's the thing. Weather changes in ways we don't always notice. Stories change every time we tell them. And official records? They're just paper. Paper yellows. Paper gets filed in the wrong drawer. Paper gets read by the wrong person at the wrong time. So before we start tonight, let's get comfortable with the idea that sometimes the smallest detail, the thing everyone overlooked, is the only thing that actually matters. Welcome back. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Genuinely. Only if you like this kind of thing, though. We're not going to trick you into it. And yeah, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Are you in bed? In your car? In that specific waiting room of your life where nothing makes sense? I want to know. And if you haven't already, dim the lights. Get yourself a blanket. Maybe turn on a fan so you can hear something other than your own thoughts. It's oddly comforting when you're about to hear about 3 people who disappeared and took their answers with them. A couple of quick questions before we dive in. What did people do before fingerprint powder? Like, seriously, how did they solve murders? And here's one for you. How suspicious is too suspicious? Is it suspicious if a ranger changes his story after 30 years? Is it suspicious if the weather reports don't match? Is it suspicious if nobody asked the right questions for 3 decades? And here's the last one, the one that matters. Why do we trust official documents more than we trust our own instincts? All right, you're about to enter the summer of 1987. 3 friends are packing a truck. The mountains are calling. And somewhere in the Cascade Range, the weather is about to become very, very important. Congratulations. You're about to wake up in the middle of a cold case that the weather itself is trying to tell us about. Let's talk about September 16th, 1987. You wake up to it the way you wake up to most days. Sunlight, the sound of someone making coffee, the feeling that today is going to be like yesterday, and yesterday was fine, so today will probably be fine too. That's the lie we tell ourselves, isn't it? That routine is safety. That if nothing seems different, nothing probably is. 3 friends thought that way that morning. There's Marcus, 31 years old, works in accounting, the kind of guy who color codes his filing system. There's David, 29, a contractor, the one who actually knows how to set up a tent correctly. And there's Sarah, 27, a nurse, the one who packed the food and made sure they had a first aid kit and a radio. By every measure, these are the people who do things right. They're organized. They're responsible. They're the kind of friends who actually follow through on plans instead of canceling at the last minute. So when they decided to spend a long weekend camping in the North Cascades, they didn't just show up with sleeping bags. They researched trail conditions. They checked the weather forecast. They filed a trip plan with the ranger station. Everything was documented. Everything was careful. They left Everett, Washington at 6 a.m. on September 16th. 3-hour drive. Scenic route. They stopped for coffee and concrete. And someone, we don't know who, made a joke about the name of the town. That probably wasn't even funny. But they laughed anyway, because that's what friends do on the way to mountains. By 2 p.m., they'd parked the truck at the Cascade Pass trailhead. They were going to hike up to a backcountry camp, spend 2 nights, come back down on the 18th. Simple, clean, predictable. The forecast said clear skies, mild temperatures, maybe a light breeze in the evening. Nothing dramatic, nothing that should worry anyone. Marcus took a photo at the trailhead at 2:15 p.m. You can see it in the case file. 3 people smiling. David has his arm around Sarah. The sun is bright. The sky is a blue you don't see very often, even in Washington. It's the kind of blue that makes you forget bad things exist. By 6 p.m., they'd reached their camp. They set up their tents, made dinner on a camp stove, probably sat around talking until the light got too dim. Sarah called the ranger station from their radio at 6:45 p.m. Nothing urgent, just checking in, saying they were settling in for the night. The ranger who answered, we'll call him Robert, because you'll need a name for him later. He noted the call in his log. Everything normal. Everything documented. Everything that said this weekend was going to be exactly what they wanted it to be. At 7 p.m., a hiker passing by, a solo traveler named Walter, who was heading back down the mountain, reported seeing all three of them sitting around their campfire. Clear skies above, a warm wind from the south. By all visible accounts, it was a beautiful evening in the mountains. What Walter didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his memory of that moment would later become impossible. Not impossible to believe. Impossible according to the science. And that's when the weather started keeping secrets. Here's what the National Weather Service official report said the next morning. A low-pressure system moved into western Washington overnight. Wind speeds reached 45 to 55 miles per hour by midnight. Temperature dropped 18 degrees Fahrenheit between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Conditions deteriorated rapidly between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. By dawn on September 17th, there was partial snow at higher elevations, heavy rain at lower elevations, and visibility was near zero. Official, documented, published in the regional weather archives. But when search and rescue teams finally mobilized, because by the morning of September 17th, nobody had heard from the three campers, and nobody was sure why, the ranger named Robert pulled out his handwritten log from that night. His notes said something different. According to Robert's handwritten entries, conditions started deteriorating around 8:30 p.m. Wind picked up at 9 p.m. By 10:30 p.m., visibility was becoming difficult. Around midnight, he noted a temperature drop he estimated at maybe 10 or 12 degrees. He didn't have official instruments. He was just writing down what he was observing from the ranger station, 3 miles down the mountain from where the three campers were sleeping. The official Weather Service report talked about an 18-degree drop between 8 and 11 p.m. Robert's log said a 10 to 12-degree drop started around 10:30 p.m. and continued through midnight. One of them was wrong, and nobody thought to compare them carefully until years later. When the search was called off on September 24th, no bodies found, no clear evidence of what happened, just 3 missing people and a lot of unanswered questions. The case went cold, very cold, the kind of cold where time stops mattering, because nothing's happening anyway. But in 1998, 11 years later, a meteorology student named Jennifer was doing research on climate patterns in the Pacific Northwest. She was looking at historical weather data to establish baseline conditions for a climate change study. She wasn't investigating the disappearances. She wasn't looking for answers to a cold case. She was just doing her homework. And she found a discrepancy. She was comparing official National Weather Service records to historical ranger station logs archived at the Pacific Northwest Forest Service office. And she noticed that on September 16th and 17th, 1987, there was a conflict in the data. The official report said a weather system moved in and intensified rapidly between 8 and 11 p.m. But Robert's handwritten log said conditions were actually relatively stable until around 10:30 or 11 p.m. Jennifer mentioned this to her professor. Her professor, a man who actually remembered hearing about the disappearances 11 years earlier, made a phone call to the ranger station. That phone call started a chain of events that would take another 6 years to fully unfold. Because here's the thing about official records. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're incomplete. And sometimes someone makes a decision, consciously or unconsciously, about how to interpret the data, and that interpretation becomes the official story. The real question was, had Robert deliberately falsified his records, or had the National Weather Service gotten the timeline wrong in their official report? And if one of those things was true, what did it mean for what actually happened to Marcus, David, and Sarah? You know what's interesting about eyewitness testimony? It's usually the first thing they teach you about in criminology classes, and the lesson is simple. Eyewitness testimony is often completely unreliable. People misremember. They misinterpret. They fill in gaps with things that feel like they should be true, even if they aren't. But here's what the search and rescue teams did have. 3 separate witness statements from people who passed near the campsite on September 16th. The first was Walter, the solo hiker we mentioned. He passed by the campsite at approximately 7 p.m. He reported seeing 3 people sitting around a campfire. He noted that the sky was clear, The wind was gentle and the temperature felt mild. He didn't stay long, maybe 2 minutes, because he wanted to make better time getting back to the trailhead before dark. The second was a couple, Nathan and Patricia, who were staying at a small shelter about a quarter mile down the trail. They reported seeing the glow of the 3 campers fire from their location at around 7:30 p.m. They said the light was steady and strong, which meant the fire was robust and the visibility was clear. If there had been heavy clouds or fog, they wouldn't have seen the fire's glow from that distance. The third was a park ranger, not Robert, but a different ranger named David, who was conducting an evening perimeter check. He passed within about 200 yards of the campsite at 7:45 p.m. He reported that the 3 people were still awake, still around the fire, and that condition seemed calm and clear. All 3 witnesses, independently, reported clear skies, calm wind, and mild temperatures at the exact time when, according to the official National Weather Service report, conditions were supposed to be deteriorating. So either 3 unrelated witnesses all misremembered the conditions, or the Weather Service report was off by several hours. This is where the timeline starts to matter, because the search team's rescue strategy was based on the assumption that a sudden, violent weather event had caught the 3 campers unprepared. If a storm hit at 8 or 8:30 p.m. with high winds and rapid temperature drop, that explained why they didn't respond to radio calls, why they didn't hike back down the next morning, why they seemed to have simply vanished. But if the witnesses were accurate, if conditions stayed clear and calm until 10 or 11 p.m., then the timeline changes everything. It means the 3 campers had at least 3 to 4 hours of relatively stable conditions. It means they should have been able to prepare. It means they should have been able to seek shelter, consolidate, or make decisions based on approaching weather. Unless something else happened during those 3 to 4 hours, something that made weather irrelevant. Detective Morrison, who took over the case's cold case review in 2004, started reaching out to witnesses again. By that time, 17 years had passed. Memories were hazier, but when he interviewed them separately, without letting them know what the others had said, all 3 of them stuck to their stories. Walter, clear, mild. I remember thinking I was glad I didn't have to camp in bad weather. Nathan and Patricia, we could see their fire clearly. The sky was visible. It was a nice evening. Ranger David, beautiful evening. The kind of night where you actually want to be in the mountains. 3 independent statements, all consistent, all contradicting the Weather Service timeline. But here's where it gets stranger. When Morrison asked the witnesses what time it got dark, they all said approximately 8 to 8:15 p.m. And when he asked them what time they noticed the weather starting to change, the testimonies shifted. Walter had already hiked down and was at the trailhead by then. He didn't see the change. Nathan and Patricia said the fire glow dimmed and disappeared sometime between 9 and 10 p.m., and they noticed the temperature dropping after that. Ranger David said his perimeter check took him a half mile further down the trail by 8:30 p.m., and when he turned back toward the station around 10 p.m., he could feel the wind picking up and see clouds moving in. So the witnesses all agreed. Conditions started changing somewhere between 9 and 10 p.m., not between 8 and 11 p.m. like the Weather Service report said. This meant the weather didn't catch the 3 campers at 8 p.m. It caught them between 9 and 10 p.m. And in the mountains, an hour, maybe 2, can be the difference between a minor problem and a disaster. The question was, what were Marcus, David, and Sarah doing during that hour, between 8 and 9 p.m., when the weather was still calm, and they should have been preparing for what was coming? And more importantly, why would Robert handwritten log, if it was accurate, show the same timeline as the witnesses, but the official Weather Service report shows something completely different? Robert was 63 years old when Detective Morrison tracked him down in 2004. He was retired, living in Tacoma, working part-time at a hardware store. By all appearances, he was a normal man living a normal life, with no particular reason to hide anything or change his story. He'd given a statement to the original search and rescue teams in 1987. He'd cooperated fully. He provided his handwritten logs from that night. According to all documentation, he'd done his job correctly. But Morrison had questions that the original investigation hadn't asked. I need to understand your log entry from September 16th, Morrison said in the initial phone call. Specifically, I need to understand the timeline of when conditions actually changed. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I don't remember specifics. It was a long time ago. Fair, Morrison said, but your notes are specific. They're dated. They're timed. So either your notes are accurate or something changed after you wrote them. Robert agreed to meet. But when he arrived at the police station for the interview, he brought a lawyer. Not because he'd done anything wrong, his lawyer said, just as a precaution. During the formal interview, Robert provided the same story he'd always told. He monitored conditions throughout the evening. He noted them in his log. He didn't observe anything unusual until around 10 or 10:30 p.m. His log was accurate to the best of his memory. But here's where Morrison noticed something. When asked specifically why his timeline differed from the National Weather Service's official timeline, Robert's answer was vague. He said something like, I was just writing down what I observed. I wasn't operating weather instruments. Maybe the Weather Service had more accurate data. That answer bothered Morrison. Because if Robert believed the Weather Service had more accurate data, why didn't his memory change? Why didn't he second-guess his own notes? Why did he stick to his timeline when he could have easily said, I guess I was wrong? Morrison pressed him. Did anyone from the Weather Service ever contact you about the discrepancy? Did anyone ever ask you to clarify or correct your notes? Robert's answer, not that I remember. But you're aware that your timeline contradicts their report? I think so. My lawyer said we shouldn't talk about it. And there it was. The lawyer stood up. The interview was over. Robert left, and they never spoke again. But Morrison had gotten what he needed. Confirmation that Robert knew about the discrepancy, and that he'd been advised, either by his lawyer or by someone else, not to discuss it. That raised a question that Morrison couldn't answer with the information he had. Who had told Robert's lawyer to tell him not to discuss the timeline? Was it just standard legal advice? Or was someone protecting Robert from something? Morrison started digging into Robert's background, employment history, financial records, anything that might explain why a ranger would need legal protection over a weather timeline discrepancy in a cold case from 1987. What he found was interesting but not immediately conclusive. Between 1987 and 1991, Robert had received 3 promotions at the ranger station. He'd been transferred to a more prestigious facility. His salary had increased significantly. By 1992, he'd been promoted to senior regional administrator, a position typically requiring much more experience than he had. Could be nothing. Could be merit-based advancement. Could be bad luck or coincidence. Or could be someone was taking care of him. Quietly, ensuring that he was moved up and out before questions could be asked about his role in the disappearances. Not as a culprit necessarily, but as someone who knew something or had covered something up. Morrison couldn't prove it, but he could see the pattern. And the pattern suggested that Robert had made a choice sometime between September 16th, 1987, and whenever he decided to speak with a lawyer about what story he was going to tell. And that story was backed up by the only documentation he controlled, his handwritten log. But his log contradicted the official record. And that contradiction, Morrison realized, was the whole case in miniature. If Robert was telling the truth about his observations, then the Weather Service was wrong. If the Weather Service was correct, then Robert was either lying or had made catastrophic errors in judgment during the most critical night of his professional career. And 34 years later, nobody was ever going to definitively know which one was true, because one of the key witnesses had decided not to talk about it anymore. Sarah's sister was named Ellen. She was 24 years old when Sarah disappeared, young enough to feel invulnerable, old enough to understand that the world didn't actually work the way she'd been taught. By the time she was 30, she learned something that most people take decades to understand, that official processes don't always deliver justice, that systems fail families, and that sometimes you have to become your own investigator. Ellen called the ranger station every month for the first 2 years. Every single month. She'd ask for updates, for new information, for anything that might help explain what happened to her sister. By the 3rd year, the calls became less frequent, but they didn't stop. By the 5th year, she was calling twice a year. By the 10th year, once a year, she wrote letters. official requests for case review, FOIA requests for documents. She attended conferences on missing persons cases. She read books about search and rescue failures. She learned more about meteorology, mountain safety, and criminal investigation than most people who get paid to know those things. In 1995, 8 years after Sarah disappeared, Ellen used her vacation days to drive to the ranger station in person. She sat down with the current station commander and asked him to walk through the case file with her. What she wanted to know was simple. If conditions were clear until 10 p.m., what was the search and rescue team's theory about how 3 experienced campers simply vanished? The commander didn't have a good answer. He said the case had been thoroughly investigated. He said it was possible they had an accident, a fall, a sudden illness, something that happened in darkness when conditions deteriorated. But they were together, Ellen said. You don't lose 3 people who are together in a camp, unless something happened to all of them at the same time, unless they all decided to leave, unless they couldn't leave. The commander's face went still. He said something like, I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, Ellen said, that my sister was smart. She was careful. David was an experienced hiker, and Marcus wouldn't leave without telling someone where he was going. So if all 3 of them disappear without a trace, without a signal, without any attempt to return or call for help, then either they couldn't do those things, or they didn't have time to. The commander suggested that the case was closed, that all leads had been exhausted, that sometimes mysteries stay mysteries. But Ellen didn't accept that. She couldn't accept it, because accepting it meant that Sarah was just gone, and the reason she was gone didn't matter anymore. So she kept calling. She kept researching. She started a support group for families of missing persons in Washington state. She connected with other people who'd lost family members in unclear circumstances. And through those connections, through conversations with other investigators and families who'd learned to ask hard questions, she eventually heard about the weather discrepancy. It was 1998, the same year Jennifer, the meteorology student, had found it independently. Someone at the support group mentioned having read an article about the Rangers' logs contradicting the Weather Service report. Ellen's hands started shaking. She contacted Jennifer. Jennifer connected her with Morrison. And suddenly, after 11 years of silence, the case had energy again. Ellen became the case's unofficial champion. She was the person who kept calling Morrison when he got busy. She was the person who noticed when an archive file was moved. She was the person who maintained relationships with the other families, Marcus's brother, David's parents, when they wanted to give up and accept that their loved ones were simply gone. In 2003, Ellen published a short book about her experience searching for answers. It's still available online. Not many people read it, but some did, and some of those people worked in law enforcement or local government, and they started asking questions too. By the time Morrison was officially assigned to the Cold Case Review in 2004, he had already been briefed by Ellen. He knew the family's concerns. He knew what questions they wanted answered. He knew what documentation to prioritize. Ellen had essentially done the preliminary investigation that should have been done 17 years earlier, and she'd done it on her own time, with her own resources, driven by a sister who wasn't there to explain what happened to her. That's the thing about families. They don't stop looking. They don't accept closure that isn't real. They ask questions that make institutions uncomfortable. And sometimes, if they're persistent enough, they get answers. Ellen got an answer. Not the answer she wanted. Not the answer that brought her sister home. But an answer that at least explained the lie. In 2005, Morrison received a call from a woman named Dr. Rachel Chun, a meteorologist at the University of Washington's Climate Research Center. Dr. Chun had been contacted by Jennifer, the student who'd originally noticed the discrepancy. Jennifer had maintained her interest in the case, and when she learned that an official cold case review was underway, she reached out to her university's meteorology department to see if they could provide more detailed analysis. Dr. Chun had access to resources that weren't available to the original Weather Service office in 1987. She had digitized records, atmospheric models, and data sets that allowed her to reconstruct the weather conditions of September 16th to 17th, 1987, with much greater precision. What she found was startling. According to her analysis, The weather system that produced the storm actually moved more slowly than the National Weather Service had initially reported. The official timeline had been constructed from real-time observations taken during the storm, and those observations had been incorporated into a summary report that was published about 24 hours after the event. But real-time observations are often incomplete. Weather patterns are complex, and summaries written quickly don't always capture the full picture. Dr. Chen's reconstruction, based on additional data that had become available in the decade since 1987, suggested that the weather system reached the Cascade Pass area closer to 10:30 or 11 p.m., not 8 or 8:30 p.m., as the official summary had suggested. This meant Robert's handwritten log wasn't just accurate. It was more accurate than the official record. But it also meant something else. Between 8 p.m., when the three witnesses last saw the campers in clear conditions, and 10:30 p.m., when the weather started deteriorating, there was a window of about 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours during which three experienced campers had plenty of light, moonlight, their campfire, possibly flashlights, and plenty of time to prepare for approaching weather. 2.5 hours should have been enough time for them to do something. Secure the camp, build shelter, pack up and hike down in worsening, but not yet dangerous conditions. Make radio contact with the ranger station. Do something. But they didn't seem to have done any of those things. Or if they had, there was no evidence of it. Morrison brought Dr. Chen's analysis to the case review board. He presented it alongside the witness testimonies and Robert's handwritten log. The evidence was now pointing toward a specific timeline. 7 to 8 p.m., three campers are seen in clear, calm conditions. Normal activity. 8 to 10:30 p.m. Weather is clear, but cooling. A window of time exists during which the campers should have been able to prepare, communicate, or take action. 10:30 p.m. onward, weather begins deteriorating. Wind increases. Temperature drops. Visibility decreases. Morning of September 17th. Search teams find no trace of the three campers or their camp. The question the timeline raised was impossible to ignore. What happened between 8 and 10:30 p.m. that made them unable or unwilling to respond to the approaching weather? Morrison's theory, which he presented in his case review summary, was that something catastrophic happened to the three campers between 8 and 10:30 p.m., not a weather event. Something else. An accident, an injury, an encounter with another person, or some combination of factors that incapacitated all three of them simultaneously or prevented them from taking any action. And the person who would have known about this catastrophe, the person who might have observed it or had any awareness of it, was Robert, the ranger who'd been conducting his evening rounds that same night. According to his statement, Robert had been at the ranger station until about 10 p.m. when he'd begun his perimeter check. So he wouldn't have been at the campsite between 8 and 10:30 p.m. when whatever happened, unless his timeline about his own movements was as carefully constructed as his weather observations. Unless Robert had been somewhere else when he said he was at the station. And unless Robert had seen something or known something or been involved in something and had decided that the best way to protect himself was to control the narrative about the weather. Because if the weather changed at 8 p.m. like the official report said, then anything that happened between 8 and midnight was a weather emergency. Nobody could be blamed for the camper's fate. It was nature's fault. But if the weather didn't change until 10:30 p.m., then someone had 2.5 hours to do something. And if they didn't, well, that raised different kinds of questions about what really happened. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't. And here's the strange gap in between where truth lives. We know that three people went camping on September 16th, 1987. We know they reached their destination safely. We know they set up camp and made contact with the ranger station. We know that multiple independent witnesses saw them alive and, well, in clear weather conditions between 7 and 7:45 p.m. We know that by the morning of September 17th, they were gone. No bodies, no equipment, no campfire, no radio, nothing, just an empty tent and questions that wouldn't stop growing. We know that the official Weather Service report and the ranger's handwritten log contained different timelines for when the weather deteriorated. We know that subsequent meteorological analysis suggests the ranger's timeline was more accurate. We know that the ranger, Robert, received unusual career advancement after the disappearances, that he later refused to discuss the case in detail, and that someone in his life advised him not to cooperate with follow-up investigations. We know that the family of one of the missing campers conducted an independent, persistent investigation for 17 years before any official review was opened. We know that the case has never been officially solved. No bodies have been found. No crime has been charged. No perpetrator has been identified. What we don't know is the truth. Morrison's final report, published in 2006, concluded that the three campers had most likely met with an accident or a medical emergency sometime in the early evening of September 16th. He theorized that while the weather wasn't the direct cause of their disappearance, the approaching weather and increasing darkness prevented a rescue response from locating them before they died. The official ruling was accidental death by misadventure and exposure. The case was closed. But Ellen didn't accept that conclusion. She had too many questions. Why would three experienced campers all suffer the same accident? Why was there no blood, no signs of struggle, no equipment scattered around the camp? Why was the tent still standing if they'd left in an emergency? Why did the three people essentially evaporate? She started asking a different question. What if someone was at that camp that night? Someone who wasn't supposed to be there? What if a hiker had become aggressive? What if an animal, unusual, unlikely, but theoretically possible, had attacked? What if Robert had been at the camp for reasons he wasn't explaining and something had gone wrong? She compiled a list of other unsolved disappearances in Washington state during the 1980s. She found 17 cases. She looked for patterns. She found none that connected to September 1987. She interviewed other rangers who'd worked at the station during that time. Most were dead or retired. One, a man named Donald, had worked with Robert for 12 years. When Ellen finally tracked him down in 2008, he agreed to talk to her. Robert was a good man, Donald said, but he was careful about things. He kept his personal life very private. And I remember, after those three disappeared, he was very stressed, more stressed than seemed normal for a ranger dealing with a missing persons case. Like there was something else bothering him. Ellen asked, "Did you ever think he was involved?" Donald thought for a long time. Then he said, "No, but I thought he knew more than he was saying. I thought he had information that he decided not to share, and I think that decision haunted him." Donald died 2 years after that conversation. He never elaborated on what information Robert might have had. Morrison, in his official capacity, was never able to prove that anyone else was involved. He was never able to find evidence of foul play. The weather records were ultimately inconclusive about causation, even if they were clearer about timing. So the case ended. Not solved, not explained, just ended, like a story where someone forgets to write the ending and calls it a mystery instead. But here's what the case left us with. A timeline that doesn't make sense, a witness who wouldn't talk, a family that wouldn't stop asking questions, and a weather report that lied by being technically correct but fundamentally misleading. Sometimes the smallest detail, the weather report that doesn't match the ranger's log, is a thing that reveals everything. And sometimes, even when you find that detail, even when you understand what it means, the people who could explain it have already chosen their silence, and that silence is heavier than any answer could ever be. 3 campers disappeared on September 16, 1987. They disappeared in a window between clear skies and approaching weather. They disappeared while someone, somewhere, was choosing not to tell the full truth about that night. And 17 years later, their sister was still asking the question that nobody had ever fully answered. You made it through the night with 3 people who didn't make it back. You sat with the uncertainty of a case that refuses to be solved. You watched the family refuse to accept closure. You learned that sometimes the most important details are the ones written in weather logs and official reports, the ones nobody thought to compare until decades had passed. You learned that systems fail, that records lie, even when they're technically accurate, that silence can protect people in ways we'd rather not think about. And you learned something else, something that matters on nights like these. That resilience isn't always about finding answers. Sometimes it's about asking better questions. It's about refusing to accept the official story when something doesn't fit. It's about calling every month for 2 years, then every other month, then once a year. Because giving up means accepting that the person you love just vanished, and that's supposed to be enough. Ellen never found out exactly what happened to Sarah, but she found out that institutions could be challenged, that documentation could be questioned, that one-person persistence could eventually shift how an entire case was understood. And in a strange way, that became its own kind of answer. Think about your own life for a moment. Think about the people you camp with, the mountains you plan to visit, the normal days that feel like they'll never change. Think about how quickly a clear evening can become something else, not just in weather, but in everything. How a conversation can shift, how a choice can have consequences that echo for decades, how the things we choose not to say can shape the world more than the things we do. The 3 campers disappeared in 1987. The case was closed in 2006. Ellen is still alive, still asking questions, still maintaining connections with the families. The mountains are still there. The weather still changes in ways that matter. And somewhere in a file, in an archive, someone's weather log and someone's official report still don't match. If you know someone who investigates cases, who asks difficult questions, who refuses to accept surface-level answers, tell them they're doing important work. If you're that person yourself, keep going. Keep asking. Keep challenging the narratives that don't quite fit. And if you made it this far into the night with us, thank you. Click the next video when you're ready. There's another case waiting, another mystery, another question that science and persistence might finally answer. Comment below and tell me, when you're in the mountains, when the weather is clear and the evening is warm, do you ever think about what could change? Do you ever wonder what happens in those gaps between the forecast and reality? Like this video if you made it to the end. Share it if you think about cases like this one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we're going to unravel together. And now, keep that fan on. Keep those lights dim. Because somewhere right now, someone is noticing a detail that doesn't fit. Someone is about to ask a question that changes everything. And maybe tomorrow we'll tell that story too.